Chapter 24. Ilsa came in May. A gay, laughing Ilsa. Almost too gay and laughing, Emily thought. Ilsa had always been a merry, irresponsible creature, but not quite so unceasingly so as now. She never had a serious mood, apparently. She made a jest of everything, even her marriage. Aunt Elizabeth and Aunt Laura were quite shocked at her. A girl who was so soon to assume the responsibilities of wedded life should be more thoughtful and sober. Ilsa told Emily they were mid-Victorian screams. She chatted ceaselessly when she and Emily were together, but never talked to her, despite the desire expressed in her letters for old-time spiels. Perhaps she was not quite all to blame for this. Emily, in spite of her determination to be exactly the same as of yore, could not help a certain restraint and reserve born of her secret pain and her fierce determination to hide it. Ilsa felt the restraint, though wholly unsuspicious of the cause. Emily was just naturally growing a little bit new moon-ish, that was all, living there alone with those dear old antediluvians. When Teddy and I come back and set up house in Montreal, you must spend every winter with us, darling. New Moon is a dear place in summer, but in winter you must be absolutely buried alive. Emily made no promises. She did not see herself as a guest in Teddy's home. Every night she told herself she could not possibly endure tomorrow. But when tomorrow came, it was livable. It was even possible to talk dress and details calmly with Ilsa. The harebell blue dress became a reality, and Emily tried it on 2 nights before Teddy was expected home. The wedding was only 2 weeks away now. "You look like a dream in it, Emily," said Ilsa, stretched out on Emily's bed with the grace and abandon of a cat, Teddy's sapphire blotting her finger darkly. "You'll make all my velvet and lace gorgeousness look obvious and crude. Did I tell you Teddy is bringing Lorne Halsey with him for best man? I'm positively thrilled. The great Halsey! His mother has been so ill he didn't think he could come, but the obliging old lady has suddenly recovered, and he's actually coming. His new book is a wow. Everybody in Montreal was raving over it, and he's the most interesting and improbable creature. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you and he were to fall in love with each other, Emily?" "Don't go matchmaking for me, Ilsa," said Emily with a faint smile as she took off the harebell dress. "I feel in my bones that I shall achieve old maidenhood, which is an entirely different thing from having old maidenhood thrust upon you." "To be sure, he looks like a gargoyle," said Ilsa meditatively. "If it hadn't been for that, I think I might have married him myself. I'm almost sure I could have. His way of making love was to ask me my opinion about things. That was agreeable. But I had a hunch that if we were married, he would stop asking me for my opinion. That would not be agreeable. Besides, nobody could ever tell what he really thought. He might be looking as though he adored you and thinking he saw crow's feet around your eyes. By the way, isn't Teddy the most beautiful thing?" "He was always a nice-looking boy." "A nice-looking boy," mimicked Ilsa. "Emily Starr, if you ever do marry, I hope your husband will chain you in the dog kennel. I'll be calling you Aunt Emily in a minute. Why, there's nobody in Montreal who can hold a candle to him. It's his looks I love, really, not him. Sometimes he bores me. Really. Although I was so sure he wouldn't. He never did before we were engaged. I have a premonition that someday I'll throw the teapot at him. Isn't it a pity we can't have 2 husbands, one to look at and one to talk to? But Teddy and I will be by way of being a stunning couple, won't we, honey? He so dark, I so fair. Ideal. I've always wished I was a dark lady like you." But when I said so to Teddy, he just laughed and quoted the old verse. "If the bards of old the truth have told, the sirens have raven hair, but over the earth since art had birth, they paint the angels fair." That's the nearest Teddy will ever get to calling me an angel. Luckily, for when all's said and done, Emily, I'd rather... Are you sure the door is shut so that Aunt Laura won't drop dead? I'd much rather be a siren than an angel, wouldn't you? Let's check up the invitations now and make sure we haven't left anybody out, was Emily's response to this riot of words. Isn't it terrible to belong to a clan like ours? Said Ilsa peevishly. There's such a ghastly lot of old frumps and bores that have to be among those present. I hope someday I'll get where there are no relations. I wish the whole damn affair was over. You're sure you addressed a bid to Perry, aren't you? Yes. I wonder if he'll come. I hope he will. What a goose I was ever to fancy I cared so much for him. I used to hope all sorts of things, in spite of the fact I knew he was crazy about you, but I never hoped after Mrs. Chidlaw's dinner dance. Do you remember it, Emily? Yes, Emily remembered that. Till then, I'd always hoped a little that someday when he realized he couldn't have you, I'd catch his heart on the rebound. Wasn't that the Victorian phrase? I thought he'd be at the Chidlaws. I knew he had been invited, and I asked Teddy if Perry were coming, and Teddy looked right into my eyes meaningly and said, Perry will not be here. He's working on the case he has to appear in tomorrow. Perry's goal is ambition. He has no time for love. I knew he was trying to warn me, and I knew it was no use to go on hoping anything. So I gave up, definitely. Well, it's turned out all right. Isn't it charming how things do turn out so beautifully? Makes one quite believe in an overruling providence. Isn't it nice to be able to blame everything on God? Emily hardly heard Ilsa as she mechanically hung up the blue dress in her closet and slipped into a little green sport suit. So that was what Teddy had said to Ilsa that night years ago when she knew he had uttered the word love, and she had been so chilly to him because of it. Well, not likely it mattered. No doubt he had only been warning Ilsa because he wanted her to turn her maiden thoughts from Perry and concentrate them on himself. She felt relieved when Ilsa finally went home. Ilsa's light, continual chatter rather got on her nerves, though she was ashamed to admit it. But then her nerves were on edge under this long, drawn-out torture. 2 weeks more of it, and then, thank God, at least peace. She went up to the tansy patch in the desk to take back a book Mrs. Kent had lent her the night before. The visit must be made before Teddy came home. She had been up to the tansy patch several times since that first evening, and an odd sort of friendship had sprung up between her and Mrs. Kent. They lent each other books and talked of everything except the one thing that mattered most to them. The book Emily was returning was an old copy of the South African Farm. Emily had expressed a wish to read it, and Mrs. Kent had gone upstairs and presently came down with it, her white face a little whiter, and the scar burning redly across it as always when she was deeply moved. "Here is the book you want," she said. "I had it in a box upstairs." Emily finished reading the book before she went to sleep. She was not sleeping well now, and the nights were long. The book had a musty, unaired odor. Evidently the box Mrs. Kent spoke of had not been opened for a long time, and in it Emily found a thin letter, unstamped, addressed to Mrs. David Kent. The curious thing about the letter was that it was, apparently, unopened. Well, letters often resealed themselves like that if placed under pressure, when the flap had pulled open and torn in the first opening. Not likely it was of much significance, but of course she would mention it when she took the book back. "Did you know there was a letter in this book, Mrs. Kent?" "A letter? Did you say a letter?" "Yes, addressed to you." Emily held the letter out to Mrs. Kent, whose face became ghastly as she looked at the handwriting. "You found that in that book?" she whispered. "In that book that hasn't been opened for over 25 years? Do you know who wrote this letter? My husband wrote it, and I have never read it, never known of it. Emily felt herself in the presence of some tragedy, the secret torture of Mrs. Kent's life, perhaps. "I will go away, so that you can read it alone," she said gently, and went out, leaving Mrs. Kent standing in the shadowy little room, holding the letter in her hand as one might hold a snake.